There are many prototypes of Jesus in the Old Testament. What was it, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at how the gospel is found in the life story of Joseph, how there are many things that mirror the image of Christ. You look at Samuel, who is shown just as Joseph was shown when he was very young, and as he grew up, what is mentioned about him is repeated about Jesus in Luke 2:52. And he grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. And we find several characters in the Old Testament that when they sort of rise above the others, what we find are very particular traits within them that are, for lack of a better term, a prototype of Christ, or an image of what God has in store for the ultimate and the perfect man, the perfect human. In Joshua 24, we find the end of Joshua's life. Starting in verse 29, after these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And we'll stop right there just to mention, Joshua is actually a descendant of Joseph. He's of the tribe of Ephraim, one of Joseph's sons. Verse 11, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. You know, if you were to think of, say, New Testament characters, are there any New Testament characters of which it was said, when this person was on the scene, then everybody in the church did what was right their whole life, and even all of those who were under his leadership that outlived him? No, you can't, can you? This is not an insignificant statement. That Joshua and those whom he mentored, they were so faithful to God that Israel followed after God faithfully all the days of Joshua and all the days of those who came after him. The beginning of Joshua is something that we look at quite a bit. The idea of being strong and courageous. The idea of this is the conquest. Joshua is the conquest book. And it is the time when they're going to go in and finally take the promised land the way that God promised and told them, everywhere that you go, everywhere that your foot touches, it's already been given to you. And that's what you find in chapter 1 of Joshua. If you start in verse 5, this is what it says. In particular, this is what the Lord says to Joshua. He says, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And so the Lord makes the promise to him that he and the nation would be prosperous as long as they're faithful to God. And so Joshua stands today among all of those in the Bible as one of the greatest leaders. And incidentally, Joshua is the name Jesus, just in a different language. The Hebrew name Yeshua is Joshua in Hebrew and in English, and somehow or another when we have them translated then to English, they're Jesus and Joshua, but they're really just the same word there in Hebrew. And so that's another little tidbit there as far as God setting the stage of these are the things and the patterns to look for when you find the ultimate one who has come. These are carrying those those characteristics. And so I want to look at Joshua and really just this a very simple lesson and look at him as sort of a case study in leadership. What he was able to do and the simple ways that he was able to do it. The first thing about him is that he was just somebody who was humble. He wasn't someone who, when he was young, say like the age of Saul, when he was really a person of influence among the Jews in the first century, young and making a name for himself. It doesn't seem to be that Joshua was like that. Joshua was just a servant. In Exodus 24 and Exodus 33, and actually in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 1, he is called the assistant of, do you know who he was the assistant of? He was the assistant of Moses. He was just the guy who was there helping out. I forgot my pen. Will you get it? Where did I put my car keys, right? I mean, he was that guy. He was just kind of a nobody, right? He was just a humble servant. He was there just helping out. Now, to help out Moses was no small thing, right? But I do find it interesting that in helping out Moses and the things that Moses would have to tend to, that it wouldn't be a Levite, but I guess that's, he was doing things that wouldn't necessarily need to have the descendancy of Levi to have to do. But I find that very fascinating. And so, right out of the gate, when you see where he comes from, it's this example of someone who it's not really a big deal for them to just find themselves in a servant type of a role, of just serving others and being content with that and not needing really anything more. And you might say even mastering self-denial, mastering being attentive to the needs of others. That's what he was doing when he was helping out Moses. And of course, Joshua is eventually exalted by God himself. In Joshua 4, verse 14, it says, on that day the Lord... Now, there's sort of some events that lead up to this, but then it says, on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the day of his life. And now, that's no small thing either. And when he was exalted by God, they looked at him the same way they looked at Moses. I mean, do you remember how long they mourned after Moses died? I think it was 30 days. This was no small thing for him to be exalted. And of course, the real key there is he's exalted by God. He leaves that up to God. He's humble himself, and then he allows God to use him however he wants to use him. And this is where God sees him as most useful. But there's an interesting incident right before they go in to take Jericho. I don't know if you remember this incident in Joshua chapter 5. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive into the meaning of this, but let's just read through this and see what it says. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? He barely didn't know who he was. And he said, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Now, what in the world does this mean, and who in the world is this guy? Well, one of the simple points is this. While he had just in the previous chapter been exalted and everybody looked up to him, he met someone who, when he immediately found out who he was quick to immediately fall down before this guy. Now, who was this guy? If you go back to Exodus 23, and I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there was a promise that God would send his angel to help secure the promises that he had told them he would in the promised land. Now, we don't know exactly how that manifested, but there are some people that think that this is the angel of the Lord, and that perhaps this is him showing up on the scene. And some people would even say that whenever you find the statement, the angel of the Lord, which you don't exactly find in this paragraph, but whenever you find the statement, the angel of the Lord, There are many people who would say that that's different than any other angel. That's actually God manifesting himself as a person, who would be who? Jesus. Now that's just speculation. And these are sort of the theories that swarm around this. But he's met a guy that he doesn't know. There was a promise that God would send an angel. And it seems as if when he finds out who he is, well, I'm the commander of the Lord's armies, that he immediately knew who this guy was. And he immediately fell down before him. And so Joshua was, you might say, a servant by nature, just brought up to be that way. God elevates him, but he's very quick to be subservient. He's full of humility. I'll wait for just a second. Just want to remind you, one of the things we've been discussing, especially in this morning's lesson, was that you have this misunderstanding amongst the apostles of Christ and the disciples when they're trying to figure out the nature of the kingdom. Is it a physical kingdom, spiritual kingdom, that sort of thing? And they wanted to sit on the right and left hand, and they wanted to have status. This morning we talked about how Jesus says, essentially, there's no rank in the kingdom. And they were looking for a particular type of rank. And in Mark chapter 10, 43 and following, Jesus has this to say about that. He says, "But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." And of course, the example in John 13 is that he washes their feet and he says, "What have I done? You need to do the same to each other." That's who you need to be. Now, just at the outset of this lesson, in thinking about looking at Joshua and that he is a case study in leadership, I know that there are a lot of people, and this is a valid sort of a thing. There are a lot of people who take issue with studies in leadership or how to be a good leader or that sort of a thing. Now, why do you think that is? I'm curious. Do you know why people take issue with that? Do you know that while there are qualifications of elders in the church, what are we commanded and encouraged and charged to be as Christians? We're charged to be faithful disciples. The New Testament is not generally about how you can be the best leader, because not everybody really is, you might say, given towards that sort of a role. Some are and some are not. Some want it and aren't, and some are not. Some are equipped for it and are timid about it. It takes God, like in the life of Joshua, sort of stepping in, and maybe today providentially and showing someone, no, you need to take some responsibilities here. But then I would even take issue with the people that take issue with this. Because when we think about the idea of a leader, all a leader is someone who, because they have shown themselves to be proficient in being responsible and faithful to God, naturally have people that look to them and follow their example. And so, by the very nature of us dedicating ourselves to being faithful Christians and setting a good example for others just simply by our faithfulness, not because we have exalted ourselves or because we've said, ooh, I want to be in a place of influence and I want to be a leader, I want to be an elder, something like that. Regardless of who you are or where you find yourself or what your personal ministry is in the church, when you are doing it with all of your heart and you are doing it faithfully, then you, by the very nature of your faithfulness, become a leader to people who are trying to be proficient and faithful like you. And so the idea of looking at people and how they became a good leader becomes, I think, a very valid thing, because essentially what we're looking for when we're looking for someone who is a leader or leader qualities is we're looking at someone who has shown themselves to be so faithful to God that God has blessed them with particular responsibilities and people naturally follow them in their example. Which means that leadership status is the, you might say, not the unintentional, but the indirect result or goal that we should all have when we're being faithful. I think that that's what happened with Joshua. Joshua was just kind of minding his own business, doing what Moses wanted him to do, and along the way, God said, your faithfulness, Your faithfulness makes you someone worth following. And when you think about the description of Moses, that he was called what? He was called the most humble man to ever live. He was go and talk to Pharaoh. No, I don't know if I can do that, right? God said, well, okay, well, I'll help you out a little bit with that. And that the people understood the character and the nature, the disposition of Moses, so much so that they looked up to him to the extent that God needed to point out during the transfiguration and by inspiration in Hebrews that Moses is not the one to be followed anymore. That's how much they revered him. And the next generation of leader that follows after Moses, they knew him also well enough to revere him in the same way. And so we can look at it as not as some sort of dictatorial or, the way that kings work where, well, I'm going to execute or I'm going to assassinate my brother so that I can be the next king, and they sort of weasel their way into that place. It's not what we're talking about. A true leader of God is someone who by faithfulness and a humble character is someone who people naturally see as someone they desire to follow and look up to. That's what I think we find in this case study of Joshua. Also, and that's very simple, right? To be a good leader, you have to have humility. And I've lost my notes here. A second one, and this is very simple too. Not only was Joshua a man of humility, he was just a man of faith. And in particular, a man of faith and trust. Without that, it's a no-go. It's a non-starter. He's not going to get off the ground in anything, because when God tells somebody to do something and they begin to try to second guess it or insert their own wisdom into it or give in to fear or pressure from the outside, then they're useless for God. Sad to say, most people respond to God that way. They respond to God in a shifty, second-guessing, I think I can do it better, I don't want to offend these people, or I want to go along with this, or I want to, my family feeling, all these certain things that people struggle with. But Joshua, he just trusted God. In the beginning of Numbers, here's a little quiz for you, okay? Genesis tells a long story. We're just going through the Pentateuch here. Genesis tells a very long story of a lot of characters. Then we begin to narrow it down with Exodus that starts with who? Exodus is a story at the beginning about what character? Moses. And Moses does what? Ultimately, he takes the people out of Egypt, right? Well, yeah, he leaves and comes back. He takes the people out of Egypt. And Exodus ends where? Do you remember? Exodus ends at Mount Sinai. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Leviticus is the law, right? And Leviticus and the events that take place in Leviticus take place where? And I'll give you a hint. It's all in one place. There's still a Mount Sinai, right? It's all chronological here, okay? Then the book of Numbers, which, do you remember what the alternate name for the book of Numbers is? Do you remember? It's real simple. It's in the wilderness. Now, Numbers chronologically takes place right after Leviticus, which means it starts where? Starts at Mount Sinai. There we go. See, it's real simple, right? And then there's about 3 locations that are the main locations. And in the middle of that, the story of Numbers, or in the wilderness, where are they? For the most part. When they're in the wilderness, where are they? They're in the wilderness. That was not a trick question. They're in the wilderness. Okay. All right. They're not a particular. Now, at the end of Numbers, where are they? Just east of the Jordan. The plains of, do you remember? The plains of Moab. And that is the stage for Deuteronomy, where Moses essentially reminds them of the law and of their charge from God before they go into the promised land, and then his death, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. What's the next one? Joshua. And so we find these events are all intertwined with Joshua's life. He's lived through all of this stuff. And so in the book of Numbers, when they left Sinai, where were they going to go? I did a lesson about this last year, actually. It's one of my shorter lessons that I did a video of. It's one of the ones that I did in this room when it was empty, which is really bizarre. But do you remember where they were going to go? Why were they going to count everybody? What were they counting? Do you remember? They were counting to see who could fight, because where were they going? Were they going to the wilderness for 40 years? That wasn't their plan, right? They were going to the promised land. They were going right there, which meant what? Which meant essentially the story that you find in Numbers and Deuteronomy are unintentional. They weren't planned. They shouldn't have happened. That wasn't God's plan. Those stories happened because of sin and because of doubt. Because when God told the people, go and do this thing, they said, I don't know if you got the best idea here, God. I think we've got it figured out better than you. But Joshua was a man of faith and trust. Numbers 14, starting in verse 7. The land which we pass through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Who said this? Do you remember? Caleb and Joshua. This was their report after the 10 spies said, we can't do it. They were afraid. They were scared. And because of their unfaithful report, their untrusting report, then God said, no, I can't work with this generation. But Caleb and Joshua were a generation that were coming up. In fact, when Joshua is mentioned as the assistant of Moses, I think at the first time, he's described as a very young man, which means that after 40 years in the wilderness, he probably would have been, I'm guessing probably would have been in his early 50s. And so when we get to the book of Joshua, that's the age group that we're looking at, because he would have been, when they went into the wilderness, we know that he had to have been below the age of 20. We're guessing, right? Because everybody above the age of 20, they didn't make it out of there. But Joshua was one of those. And that's one of the reasons why he was the natural leader for that generation, is because he was right there all along, the assistant of Moses. And he was faithful and trusted God. When God told Joshua how to go and take Jericho, I have a question for you. And we're going to read this, and then I'm going to ask you again. When they took Jericho, how did they take it? How? And it's a really simple answer. Joshua 6, starting in verse 1. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus you shall do it for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day, you shall march around, I'm losing my place. On the 7th day, you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow their trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight before him. Now, we know this, right? This is a fun kid's story, or a very brutal and violent kid's story, I guess, right? Okay, so how did they take the city? And you might say, well, what are you talking about? He just described how they were going to take the city, right? They just had to do this, except that this plan is nuts, right? This plan doesn't make any sense. God told us, one of us to do this, and we didn't know how the story went. We'd probably thinking, wait a second, we're not attacking. We're not going to touch the walls. We're not going to, what are you talking about? If you know anything about the ancient city of Jericho itself, it was a formidable place. It was, for lack of a better term, it would have been difficult to take at all, just if they just happened upon it and said, hey, we're going to take this place. But God's plan is walk in circles and play some horns and shout. And so the question is, how did they take the city? In Hebrews 11 and verse 30, I love it when y'all can read my mind, right? See, whenever y'all answer questions like that, I'm thinking, whenever I ask those other questions, and y'all look at me like, what is he talking about? See, I think I'm going to think back to this one. Y'all all got this one, right? Because in Hebrews 11 verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. That really is the key to it all. It is this disposition or mindset that says, okay, my trust, my obedience, my faithfulness to God do not require me understanding why God wants me to do what He wants me to do. It doesn't require that. I just need to have faith and trust. When I have faith and trust, then I can know what? Borrow from this morning. We can know that God will do what? What is right. We know that He'll do what is right to us. I will even say this. This was the key to him accomplishing God's charge to be strong and courageous. The only way is to be faithful and trusting in the strength of God. Only then can you be bold, strong, courageous, and go in and take the promises. Lastly, only three of these character traits. Joshua was a man full of humility, faith and trust, but also he was just a man of God's word. He was a man who took what God said seriously. And his success was directly dependent upon this. Just want to remind you of a couple of verses that we already looked at from chapter 1, just verses 7 and 8 of Joshua 1. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. And so that's the promise and the charge. If you'll hold to this, and of course we know that Joshua did. One of the first things that Joshua did, in fact, it's right after this charge, just a few verses down in chapter 1. If you remember this occasion where there are some tribes that are to the east of the Jordan. And you remember the promised land is to the west of the Jordan. But there were, I think it was Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh, I believe, if I remember correctly. And they said, you know what, we kind of like this land over here to the west. And you know what Joshua told them? He had to remind them, he says, now you can't just come and stay here and not go to war with your brethren. And it says that he reminds them of what God's command was to the people. And of course they said, oh, well, we weren't going to lay low while they went to war. We're going to go with them. We promise, we weren't trying to get out of this thing. But that's one of the first things he does, is he reminds them of their obligation. One of the great scenes that I wish that I could have witnessed in ancient times where Israel was in the Promised Land was when they would go to the mountain range of Mount Ebal and Mount Garrison. If you know anything about Mount Ebal and Mount Garrison, See, we know about Mount Sinai. We know like Mount Carmel over by the coast where Elijah was. We know Mount Zion. Jerusalem was built on 7 mountains. We also have Mount Ebal and Mount Garrison. And there are a few notable mountains. But Mount Ebal and Mount Garrison are essentially like a horseshoe-shaped rim of mountains. And traditionally, this is what they would do. They would go to the mountain, and the people would stand sort of along the top and inside the horseshoe, and they would say the law and echo it back to each other. And that's one of the places that they would go and remind each other and teach each other what the law was. I would love to have witnessed that. But you find that in Joshua chapter 8, where Joshua essentially renews the covenant or reminds them of the covenant there. Joshua 8, starting verse 34. Afterwards he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that was written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the sojourners who lived among them. Every word that Moses commanded, he read all of them to them. As I was studying through this and reading just this idea, wouldn't you like to say that those who are in your immediate sphere of influence, wouldn't it be really a cool thing to be able to say, there wasn't anything that God said for us to do that I did not say to them? What a great goal that is. There isn't anything that God has told us to do that I haven't shared with the people that I love. Whether it's immediate family or kids or whatever. And that's what we find here. That he didn't let one word of it go unread to them. And essentially at every point, Joshua was faithful to it. A couple passages, Joshua 11:15, Joshua 23 and verse 6. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Therefore, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left. And that's, of course, Joshua talking to the people. He set that example. And you might say that kind of, I would say squeezed in here, but a sub-point of this point about being a person of the Word is simply that he was effective in that he was not a hypocrite. He actually lived it. So he sets the example, and so that's why it makes sense that all of the people that lived while he was the leader, they were faithful to God, and then the people after him, they were all faithful to God too, that he influenced a generation that thoroughly. I just want to end with a couple of echoes of that from the New Testament. In 1 Timothy 4 and verse 16, Paul tells Timothy, keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching, persist in it, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers. There's always been this command of following after, heeding to what God has commanded. God has revealed himself to us for the very purpose of saving us. That's what James 1:21 says essentially. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. And so as we look at this case study, this character study of Joshua as being such a devoted follower or disciple of God, being faithful in his service and in his assistant capacity to Moses, and then doing a stellar job of carrying on the torch, and I would say not particularly carrying on the torch of leadership, but just carrying on the torch of faithfulness. That we find in here a very simple lesson, and yet profound. Truth is essentially simple. The basics of who God calls us to be, they're simple. It isn't complicated. It just takes a choice. And Joshua made a choice early in his life that he was going to be a humble servant of God, that he was going to be faithful, And he was essentially just going to listen to what God said and not question it and just trust. And so I hope this has been interesting, encouraging to you in some way, just to revisit who is a very well-known character. And that as we look at this, we can look and see someone who not only was worthy for the people around him to follow, but he's someone that's worthy for us to look to and to study and to see, how can I grow in my faithfulness? What are the ways that I can face challenges? What is an appropriate way to have humility? What is the right way to handle what God has said for me? And we find, as we look through the Bible, we find many people who didn't do that, but many people who did. And I would even say this, as to keep things real here. We talk about Joshua, and we talk about Moses, and we talk about Samuel, talk about Paul and Timothy or James, and these are like far off ancient mythological characters, and not that they're mythological, but we think of them as these characters that are beyond our reach, like they're not real. That's oftentimes how we think of these people. And yet, it does us well to just pause and think, Joshua, Samuel, Paul, Timothy, David, they were all just normal people. They were normal people who just decided who they were going to be. And what's really cool about that is we get to meet them one day. I mean, they're that real. They're not so far off. No, we're going to see them soon. This life is going to be over pretty quick. And we're going to be able to have, you might say, a family reunion with people that we never met. People who faced what we faced, and yet were still humble before God and trusted God and just did what He said and allowed God to save them. That's who we can be, and we can be with that group. And there are people who, if the earth stands 100, 200, 1,000 years from now, if somehow or another some story of one of us has gone down through the ages, just that we were maybe a humble person before God, or that we trusted God, or we just loved His Word and followed it, that they will look to us and they will think, one day I'll get to meet that person. That is what it means to have eternal life. That's what it means to look at examples like this and to be able to truly relate and to truly say what their future was for them, that's what my future is for me. And that's the importance of looking and being encouraged by people like this. I hope He encourages you, and I encourage you more and more to study these who you one day will meet, so that we can be faithful like them. Perhaps you're struggling in your faithfulness in some way. Even maybe this morning, I gave the opportunity for people to ask for prayers and to even possibly confess sin or to repent. Maybe that's been weighing on your mind today. Maybe there's somebody who watches us online. I know some of the people here still do that when they can't be here, or someone far away. Maybe you need prayers about something. You need help with your faithfulness. You need some encouragement in some way, or some counsel, or you just need someone that can be a good influence or help you sort through the problems of life. We want to help you. We want to take you. We want to go together so that we can all, meet Joshua one day. That's our goal, to be with our Father one day. Sebastian has a song. Perhaps you need to become a Christian, be baptized into Christ. We can do that today too if you want to study about it. And so if there's anything you need, we love you. We want to help you if you need it. As we stand and sing, please make your need known.